I remember the exact moment everything shifted between us, though I didn't understand it then. It was one of those late October nights when the city outside Felix's apartment window seemed to breathe in slow, amber rhythms. Streetlights casting long shadows through glass, the distant hum of traffic mixing with the radiator's metallic sighs. We'd been watching movies for hours, the kind of mindless marathon that happens when you're 20 and have nowhere else to be, when responsibility feels like something that belongs to other people. The couch was too small for both of us, really. Felix had claimed one end early in the evening, stretching his long legs across the cushions with that casual confidence he wore like a second skin. I'd settled into the other corner, careful to maintain the invisible boundary we'd established months ago, close enough to share popcorn and commentary, far enough apart that our knees wouldn't accidentally brush. It was a geography I'd mapped and memorized, the safe distance that let me exist in his orbit without betraying the careful architecture of our friendship. The television screen painted everything blue-white, then red, then shadow again as scenes flickered past. Some action movie Felix had picked from his collection, the kind with car chases and explosions that required no real attention. I wasn't watching anyway. I was studying the way the light moved across his face, the way his eyelids had grown heavy with exhaustion, the way his breathing had settled into something deeper and more even. He was beautiful in that unconscious way that straight boys are when they think no one is looking, all sharp angles softened by sleep, all that performative masculinity melting into something more honest. I've been watching him like this for months, stealing glances when he laughed at something on his phone, memorizing the way his hands moved when he talked, cataloging every expression like I was documenting something precious that might disappear. It was dangerous territory, this careful observation, but I'd convinced myself it was harmless. Friends notice things about each other. Friends pay attention. Friends care about the small details that make someone who they are. Felix shifted, drawing his knees up slightly, and the movement broke whatever spell the quiet had cast. He turned toward me with that lazy smile he got when he was tired, the one that made his eyes crinkle at the corners and transformed his entire face into something warmer, more vulnerable. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the small distance between us, and I felt that familiar flutter of panic in my chest, the fear that he might see too much, might recognize the careful way I was studying him. Then he laughed, soft and almost embarrassed. "We probably shouldn't cuddle," he said, the words tumbling out like he'd been thinking about it for a while. "That's weird, right?" The question hung in the air between us, loaded with implications I didn't dare examine too closely. I managed what I hoped was a casual shrug, some non-committal sound of agreement, even as my heart started beating faster. Of course it would be weird. We were friends. Best friends, maybe, but still just friends. Friends didn't cuddle on couches during late-night movie marathons. Friends maintained appropriate boundaries. Friends didn't let themselves want things that would complicate everything. But even as I agreed with him, even as we both acknowledged the absurdity of the idea, Felix was already moving. It was subtle at first, a slight shift in his weight, a casual adjustment of position that brought him a few inches closer. Then his arm was lifting, reaching across the space between us, and settling around my shoulders with a gentleness that felt both natural and earth-shattering. I went rigid at first, every muscle in my body suddenly hyper-aware of the weight of his arm, the warmth of his side pressed against mine, the way his fingers rested against my shoulder blade. This was exactly what we'd just agreed not to do, exactly the line we'd just drawn in the sand. But Felix didn't pull away, didn't laugh it off, or make some joke to defuse the moment. Instead, he relaxed into the contact, his body settling against mine like it had been designed to fit there. The room fell silent except for the distant soundtrack of whatever movie was still playing, forgotten now in the wake of this small revolution. I could feel Felix's breathing against my hair, could smell the faint scent of his cologne mixed with laundry detergent, and something uniquely him. My heart was pounding so hard I was certain he could feel it through my chest. But if he noticed, he didn't say anything. He just held me there, his arm a steady weight around my shoulders, his presence both overwhelming and absolutely necessary. I told myself to breathe normally, to act like this was nothing, like friends crossed this particular boundary all the time. But my body betrayed every attempt at casualness. I was hyper-aware of every point of contact, where his thigh pressed against mine, where his shoulder met my back, where his fingers traced absent patterns against my shirt. It felt like too much and not nearly enough all at once, like standing at the edge of something vast and terrifying and beautiful. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time seemed to stretch and contract around us, marked only by the changing light from the television screen and the steady rhythm of Felix's breathing. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved to pull away. We existed in this strange, suspended moment, this quiet revolution disguised as an accident, and I found myself memorizing every detail. The weight of his arm, the sound of his heartbeat, the way the shadows fell across his face in the flickering light. I kept waiting for him to realize what we were doing, to remember his own words about how weird this would be, to laugh and disentangle himself and restore the careful distance we'd maintained for so long. But Felix stayed exactly where he was, his body relaxed against mine, his breathing deep and steady. And slowly, impossibly, I began to let myself soften into the contact, to accept this gift he was offering without explanation or apology. The touch was nothing, just two friends sharing space on a too-small couch during a late-night movie. But it was also everything. The first crack in the careful walls we'd built around our friendship, the first acknowledgement of something neither of us was ready to name. It was the moment when everything changed, though neither of us would admit it until much later. In the blue glow of the television, with Felix's arm around me and the city breathing quietly outside, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to want this. Just for tonight, just for this moment, I let myself imagine that this was normal, that this was allowed, that this was the beginning of something instead of a beautiful mistake we pretend never happened. That night on the couch wasn't the beginning of our story, though. It was the moment when everything I'd been carefully ignoring finally demanded to be seen. Felix and I had been building toward that touch for months, constructing an intimacy so gradual, so perfectly disguised as friendship, that neither of us had recognized what we were creating. We'd met during orientation week of our sophomore year, two transfers thrown together in a dorm mixer that felt like social purgatory. I remember standing against the wall with a red Solo cup of flat soda, watching clusters of 18-year-olds perform enthusiasm they didn't feel when Felix appeared beside me. He didn't introduce himself with the aggressive friendliness that characterized most college interactions. Instead, he just stood there, surveying the room with the same mixture of amusement and resignation I felt, and said, "This is exactly as terrible as I expected it to be." That was Felix, direct, unguarded, completely comfortable in his own skin in ways I envied and found magnetic. Within a week, we were inseparable. He had this way of making everything feel like an adventure, even the mundane rituals of college life. Late-night runs to the campus convenience store became explorations of off-limits areas. Dining hall meals became elaborate games where we invented backstories for other students. Study sessions in the library became quiet conversations about everything except whatever textbook lay open between us. Everyone assumed we were brothers, or at least had known each other since childhood. There was something effortless about the way we moved around each other, the way we could communicate with a glance across a crowded room, the way we naturally fell into step when we walked. People would ask how long we'd been friends, and we'd exchange looks before Felix would grin and say, "Forever, apparently." But Felix was also unmistakably, undeniably straight. At least, that's what I told myself as I watched him charm his way through parties, his easy confidence drawing girls into his orbit like metal filings to a magnet. He was the kind of attractive that seemed almost unfair, tall and lean with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that looked accidental, but probably wasn't, eyes that shifted between brown and gold depending on the light, a smile that transformed his entire face. He flirted with the casual expertise of someone who had never been rejected, who had never had to calculate the risk of showing interest in another person. I learned to navigate around his relationships with the careful diplomacy of someone who had practiced staying invisible. When he started seeing Jessica from his economics class, I made myself scarce during the hours when she might stop by. When he got drunk at parties and disappeared with whatever girl had caught his attention that night, I found other people to talk to, other places to be. I became an expert at reading the signs, at knowing when to give him space, at pretending it didn't matter who he kissed in the corner of someone's living room. What I couldn't ignore was how he was with me when those relationships ended. He'd show up at my door at odd hours, restless and dissatisfied in ways he couldn't articulate. We'd order Chinese food and watch movies until dawn, talking about everything except whatever girl had just exited his life. During those nights, Felix became someone softer, more thoughtful, more present. He'd curl up on my couch with his head on the armrest, his legs stretched across my lap, and talk about his childhood, his family, his fears about the future in ways that felt like secrets. Those were the moments that sustained me, the hours when I could pretend that his seeking me out meant something beyond friendship. I told myself I was reading too much into the way he looked at me during those conversations, the way his hand would find mine when he was making a point, the way he seemed to need my particular kind of listening. I convinced myself that the electricity I felt during our accidental touches was entirely one-sided, that the way he always chose the seat next to mine was simple habit, that his insistence on goodbye hugs was just his natural warmth extended to everyone in his life. But there were signs I couldn't quite dismiss, small inconsistencies in the story I'd constructed about our friendship. The way he never talked about his relationships with me in any detail, as if that part of his life existed in a separate compartment. The way he seemed almost relieved when things ended with whatever girl he was seeing, like he was returning to his natural state. The way he looked at me sometimes really looked with an attention that felt too intense for casual friendship. And then there were the touches. Felix was naturally physical, the kind of person who communicated through contact, but with me, there was something different. A lingering quality to his hand on my shoulder, a reluctance to move away when we accidentally brushed against each other, a habit of finding reasons to be close. He'd lean over my shoulder to read something on my laptop screen, his breath warm against my neck. He'd absently play with my hair when we watched movies, his fingers gentle and methodical. He'd fall asleep against my shoulder during long car rides, his weight settling against me with complete trust. I cataloged these moments like evidence, turning them over in my mind late at night, looking for patterns, for meaning, for any indication that I wasn't imagining the undercurrent that seemed to run beneath our friendship. But Felix never acknowledged these touches as anything unusual, never seemed to notice the way they affected me, never gave any sign that they meant more to him than casual contact between friends. So I learned to live in the space between hope and resignation, to treasure these small intimacies while expecting nothing more. I convinced myself that being near him as a friend was enough, that I could sustain myself on the scraps of closeness he offered without ever asking for more. I told myself I was lucky to have him in any capacity, that risking our friendship for something uncertain and potentially one-sided would be the height of selfishness. The night on the couch, when he wrapped his arm around me despite his own words about how weird it would be, was the first time I wondered if maybe I'd been wrong about what he wanted. Maybe we'd both been performing straightness and casual friendship, while something else grew in the spaces between us, something neither of us had been brave enough to name. After that night on the couch, something fundamental shifted in the gravity between us. Felix didn't mention what had happened, didn't acknowledge the 47 minutes we'd spent pressed together watching credits roll across his television screen. The next morning, he made coffee like always, handed me a mug with the same casual smile he'd worn for months, and suggested we grab breakfast at the diner down the street. Everything appeared exactly as it had been, except for the weight of what we'd shared hanging invisible in the air between us. But I carried that memory like a secret treasure, replaying the feeling of his arm around me, the steady rhythm of his breathing against my hair, the way he'd held me like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told myself it had been a fluke, an accident of exhaustion and proximity that meant nothing beyond the moment itself. Yet some part of me had been fundamentally altered by that contact, awakened to possibilities I'd spent months convincing myself didn't exist. The next time we hung out, 3 days later, I was hyper-aware of every movement, every gesture, every opportunity for contact. Felix seemed the same as always, sprawled across his bed while I sat at his desk, talking about some professor's impossible midterm expectations. But I found myself cataloging the distance between us, noting the careful way we avoided accidental touches. It felt like we were both performing normalcy, both pretending that nothing had changed while navigating around the ghost of that embrace. Then, without warning, Felix shifted. He was in the middle of complaining about his psychology class when he moved from his bed to the floor, settling beside my chair with his back against the wall. Our shoulders brushed as he got comfortable, and instead of the quick contact I expected, he stayed there, his arm warm against mine. He continued talking as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the deliberateness of the choice, the way he'd positioned himself just close enough that we were touching. I tried to concentrate on his words, something about operant conditioning and rats and mazes, but my entire awareness had narrowed to the point where our shoulders met. He wasn't pulling away. Neither was I. We sat like that for nearly an hour, maintaining this small, electric contact while discussing everything except what was happening between us. From that point forward, our physical boundaries began to dissolve in increments, so small they felt accidental. A hand on my back as he passed behind my chair, his fingers brushing mine when he handed me something. The way he'd lean against me while we looked at something on his laptop, his weight settling against my side with increasing familiarity. Each touch lasted a little longer than necessary, lingered just beyond the realm of casual friendship. The breakthrough came during a movie night 2 weeks later. We'd chosen his place because my roommate had friends over, and Felix had pulled out every blanket he owned, creating an elaborate nest on his couch. He'd dimmed the lights and ordered pizza, and there was something deliberately cozy about the entire setup that made my heart race with possibility. We started the evening on opposite ends of the couch, but as the night progressed, we gravitated toward each other with the inevitability of celestial bodies. First, Felix stretched his legs out, his feet nearly touching my thigh. Then I shifted to make room, which brought us closer together. When he reached for the remote, his hand grazed my arm, and instead of pulling back, he let it rest there. The movie was some noir film he'd been wanting to see, all shadows and dramatic lighting, but I couldn't focus on the plot. I was too aware of Felix beside me, the way he was slowly, almost imperceptibly moving closer. His thigh pressed against mine when he adjusted his position. His shoulder brushed my arm when he reached for his drink. Each contact felt intentional now, charged with meaning that neither of us was ready to acknowledge out loud. Then the apartment's heating system kicked on with a mechanical groan, and Felix made a show of shivering. "Too cold," he said, though the temperature felt perfectly comfortable to me. Without waiting for a response, he grabbed the largest blanket from his collection and spread it across both of us, creating a shared cocoon that made the distance between us disappear entirely. Under the blanket, everything changed. Felix's hand found mine in the darkness, his fingers intertwining with mine with a naturalness that took my breath away. He shifted closer, his side pressing against mine, and I could feel the warmth of his body through his shirt. We stayed like that for the remainder of the movie, holding hands beneath the blanket while maintaining perfect silence about what was happening. When the credits began to roll, neither of us moved to turn on the lights or disentangle ourselves. Felix's thumb traced small circles against my palm, a gesture so intimate it made my chest tight with longing. In the flickering blue light from the television screen, I turned to look at him and found him already watching me, his expression serious and unguarded. For a moment, we simply looked at each other, the space between us charged with everything we weren't saying. Then Felix squeezed my hand gently, a gesture that felt like both question and answer, and settled his head against my shoulder with a sigh that sounded like coming home. This time, when his breathing deepened and his body relaxed against mine, I didn't tell myself it was an accident. I didn't search for explanations or make excuses for the intimacy we were sharing. Instead, I let myself sink into the moment, into the warmth of his body pressed against mine, into the quiet revolution we were staging beneath the cover of friendship. The silence between us had become something different now. Not the absence of words, but the presence of understanding. We were crossing lines we'd drawn for ourselves, entering territory neither of us had mapped, and somehow it felt like the most natural progression in the world. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, but inside Felix's apartment, time seemed suspended around us, holding space for whatever we were becoming. The morning after Felix fell asleep with his head on my shoulder, I woke up in his bed. Not beside him. That would have been too much, too obvious, but in his spare blanket on the floor while he slept peacefully above me, one arm dangling over the edge of the mattress. I must have carried him there some time before dawn, though I had no memory of the transition from couch to bedroom. What I remembered was the weight of his body against mine, the way his breathing had synchronized with my own, the careful way I'd held perfectly still for hours to avoid disturbing his sleep. When Felix finally stirred, he looked down at me with a sleepy confusion that quickly shifted into something softer, more knowing. He didn't ask why I'd stayed, didn't make jokes about the unconventional sleeping arrangement. Instead, he just smiled and said, "Coffee," and the morning proceeded with the same careful normalcy we'd been perfecting for weeks. But something had crystallized overnight, some understanding that we were no longer pretending this was accidental. The touches that followed became more deliberate, more sustained, more openly enjoyed. When we studied together in the library, Felix would position himself close enough that our thighs pressed together beneath the table. During long conversations in his room, he'd stretch out on his bed and pat the space beside him, an invitation I no longer hesitated to accept. The transformation was gradual but unmistakable. What had once been careful negotiations around physical space became an easy intimacy that felt both new and inevitable. Felix would absently play with my hair while we watched television, his fingers gentle and methodical as they traced patterns against my scalp. I'd find myself leaning into these touches, my eyes closing with pleasure I no longer tried to hide. Our late-night conversations took on a different quality, too. Felix began sharing things he'd never mentioned before. Childhood fears, family tensions, dreams he'd never spoken aloud. These confessions came in the darkness of his room, both of us lying on his bed fully clothed, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. His voice would drop to almost a whisper during these moments, as if speaking too loudly might break whatever spell allowed for such honesty. He told me about the pressure he felt to be the person everyone expected, confident, successful, effortlessly masculine. He talked about the loneliness that came with always being the one others relied on, never having space to be vulnerable or uncertain. He admitted that most of his relationships felt like performances, like he was playing a role he'd memorized but never truly inhabited. In return, I found myself sharing parts of my story I'd kept carefully hidden. Not the full truth, not yet, but pieces of it. The difficulty of always feeling slightly outside of things, the exhaustion of constantly monitoring myself for signs that might give me away, the way I'd learned to find satisfaction in other people's happiness because my own felt too dangerous to pursue. Felix listened to these confessions with an attention that felt like a physical touch, his eyes never leaving my face, his body unconsciously moving closer as I spoke. Sometimes he'd reach out and take my hand, holding it between both of his while I struggled to find words for feelings I'd never named aloud. During one of these conversations, late on a Tuesday night when the campus felt abandoned around us, Felix turned onto his side to face me fully. We were lying on top of his blankets, close enough that I could count the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, close enough that his breath stirred the air between us. "I've never felt this comfortable with anyone," he said, his voice barely audible in the darkness. "Like I can just be myself without having to think about it." The words hung between us, loaded with implications neither of us was ready to examine directly. But there was something in his expression, a vulnerability I'd never seen before, that made my heart race with possibility. "What version of yourself are you when you're with me?" I asked, surprised by my own boldness. Felix was quiet for so long, I thought he might not answer. Then he reached out and traced his fingertip along my cheekbone, a touch so tender it made my breath catch. "The real one," he whispered. That night marked another shift in our careful dance around each other. The physical closeness we'd been building toward became our natural state. Felix would curl against my side while we read, his head pillowed on my chest, my fingers automatically finding their way into his hair. We'd fall asleep during movies, tangled together on his couch, and wake up hours later still holding each other. These moments of intimacy existed in a space outside normal categorization. They felt too meaningful for friendship, too natural for experimentation, too necessary for either of us to question or resist. We were creating our own language of touch, our own vocabulary of closeness that had no name and needed none. But underneath the growing ease between us, I could sense Felix's internal struggle. Sometimes I'd catch him watching me with an expression I couldn't read, something between wonder and fear. He'd reach for me and then hesitate, his hand hovering just above my skin before making contact, as if he was still asking himself permission for each touch. I understood his hesitation because I felt it too. We were walking into territory neither of us had mapped, guided only by instinct and the overwhelming rightness of being close to each other. Every touch was both a small revelation and a step further from the safety of what we'd been before. The question that haunted us both, though we never spoke it aloud, was what we were becoming and whether we were brave enough to find out. The night I finally said the words we'd been dancing around for weeks came without warning or ceremony. It was a Thursday in early November, one of those evenings when winter first announces itself with sharp air and the promise of snow. Felix had texted me around 9, asking if I wanted to come over, and I found him restless and distracted, unable to settle into any activity for more than a few minutes. We tried watching a movie, but he kept reaching for his phone, scrolling through apps without really seeing them. We'd attempted studying, but his textbook remained unopened while he rearranged items on his desk with nervous energy. Finally, we'd given up on any pretense of productivity and simply lay on his bed in the darkness, the only light coming from the street lamp outside his window. Felix was pressed against my side, his head on my shoulder, his arm draped across my chest in a position that had become as familiar as breathing. But tonight there was a tension in his body that I could feel through his skin, a restlessness that seemed to vibrate between us. His fingers traced absent patterns against my shirt, circular motions that grew more agitated as the silence stretched. I've been watching the play of shadows on his ceiling, trying to identify the source of his unease, when he shifted suddenly. His hand stilled against my chest, and I felt him turn his face toward me, though I couldn't see his expression in the darkness. "Malcolm," he said, and something in his voice made my breath catch. There was a weight to the way he spoke my name, a gravity that suggested we were approaching something significant. "Yeah." His hand moved then, sliding up to rest against my neck, his thumb brushing along my jawline with a tenderness that made my heart race. The touch was different from all the others we'd shared, more intentional, more charged with meaning. "What were we doing?" he whispered. The question hung in the air between us, simple and impossibly complex. It was the question I'd been asking myself every night, the one that had kept me awake staring at my ceiling, the one that had transformed every casual touch into something electric and terrifying. "I don't know," I answered honestly because I didn't. I had theories, hopes, fears, but no certainty about what we'd become or where we were heading. Felix was quiet for a long moment, his thumb still tracing gentle patterns against my skin. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible. "I think about you all the time, even when I'm with other people, even when I should be thinking about something else entirely. You're always there in the back of my mind, like this constant presence I can't shake." My chest tightened at his words, at the raw honesty in his voice. This was as close as either of us had come to acknowledging what was happening between us, and it felt both terrifying and inevitable. "I think about you too," I admitted, surprised by how easily the truth came. "All the time." He shifted closer then, his face inches from mine in the darkness. I could feel his breath against my cheek, could sense the tension in his body as he struggled with whatever he was trying to say. This isn't just friendship anymore, I whispered, finally giving voice to the truth we'd been avoiding. Is it? The words seemed to hang in the air between us, heavy with implication. For a moment, Felix went completely still, and I wondered if I'd pushed too far, if naming what we were doing would somehow break the spell that had allowed it to exist. Then he exhaled slowly, a sound that carried months of tension and uncertainty. No, he said, his voice rough with emotion. It's not. The admission felt like a dam breaking, like some barrier we'd both been maintaining had finally crumbled. Felix's hand moved to cup my face, his palm warm against my cheek, and I could feel him trembling slightly. I don't know what that means, he continued, his words tumbling out in a rush. I don't know how to be this person, or want these things, or understand what's happening to me. I've never felt like this about anyone, let alone about a guy, let alone about my best friend. His confession hit me like a physical blow. Not because it was unexpected, but because it mirrored my own confusion so perfectly. The relief of finally hearing him acknowledge what we both felt was overwhelming. You don't have to know, I said, covering his hand with mine. We don't have to figure it all out tonight. But I want to understand, he said, frustration creeping into his voice. I want to know why everything feels different when I'm with you. Why touching you feels like coming home. Why the thought of not being close to you makes me panic. Because you care about me, I said simply. And I care about you. Maybe that's enough for now. Felix was quiet again, but I could feel some of the tension leaving his body. His thumb resumed its gentle movement against my cheek, and he shifted closer until our foreheads were nearly touching. I don't want to stop, he whispered, and the vulnerability in his voice made my heart ache. Whatever this is, whatever we're doing, I don't want it to end. The honesty in his words, the raw need behind them, broke something open inside me. For months, I'd been convinced that what I felt was one-sided, that I was reading meaning into touches that were simply friendly, that my feelings were a burden I had to carry alone. But here was Felix, trembling in the darkness, admitting that he felt it too. Then don't stop, I said, my voice barely audible. Don't think about what it means or what we're supposed to be. Just be here with me. He moved closer then, eliminating the last inches between us, his body pressing against mine with a desperation that spoke of months of careful restraint finally being released. His face found the curve of my neck, and I felt him breathe deeply, as if he was trying to memorize my scent. I don't know what comes next, he murmured against my skin. Neither do I admitted, my arms tightening around him. But we'll figure out together. In the darkness of his room, holding each other with a fierceness that felt like both sanctuary and revolution, we finally acknowledged what we'd been building toward all along. Not friendship, not experimentation, but something deeper and more necessary than either of us had been brave enough to name. The silence that followed wasn't uncertain anymore. It was full of possibility. The moment of truth came 3 days later, on a Sunday afternoon when the campus felt abandoned and the air carried the metallic taste of approaching snow. We'd spent the morning in Felix's room, studying for midterms with the kind of forced concentration that comes from trying to ignore the weight of unspoken words between us. Since Thursday night's confession, we'd been careful around each other, polite and distant in a way that felt foreign after months of easy intimacy. The honesty we'd shared in the darkness seemed too large for daylight, too raw for the ordinary rhythms of daily life. Felix had retreated into a politeness that felt like protection, offering me coffee with the same courteous distance he might show a casual acquaintance. I found myself doing the same, asking permission before sitting on his bed, maintaining careful space between us that had never existed before. But the tension was unsustainable. Every accidental brush of fingers when we reached for the same book sent electricity through the space between us. Every shared glance carried the memory of what we'd admitted to each other. We were trying to unknow what we knew, to unfeel what we'd acknowledged, and it was tearing us apart. The breaking point came when Felix dropped his pencil while highlighting a passage in his economics textbook. It rolled across the floor and came to rest near my foot, a simple accident that should have meant nothing. But when we both reached for it at the same time, our hands colliding in the space above the pencil, the contact felt like a live wire. We froze like that, both of us kneeling on his floor, our hands touching over something as mundane as a yellow number 2 pencil. Neither of us moved to pull away. Neither of us pretended the touch was accidental. Felix looked up at me, his eyes holding a desperation I recognized because I felt it too. The careful distance we'd been maintaining for 3 days crumbled in an instant, replaced by the overwhelming need to be close to each other that had been building for months. "We can't keep doing this," he said, his voice rough with frustration, pretending we don't feel what we feel, acting like Thursday night didn't happen. He was right. The politeness was killing us both, this careful dance around the truth we'd finally spoken. But acknowledging that didn't make the path forward any clearer. "So what do we do?" I asked, my hand still touching his over-the-forgotten pencil. Felix looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Fear battling with want, uncertainty wrestling with need. He was still the same person who'd spent years cultivating an image of effortless heterosexuality, who'd never questioned his attraction to women, who'd built his identity around being exactly who everyone expected him to be. But he was also the person who'd held me in the darkness and admitted he'd never felt anything like what existed between us. "I don't know," he said finally. "I don't know how to be the person who wants this. I don't know how to want you the way I do and still be me." The pain in his voice cut through me, the genuine confusion of someone whose understanding of himself had been fundamentally shaken. I wanted to tell him it would be easy, that wanting me didn't change who he was, that love was simple. But I knew better. I knew the terror of recognizing desires that didn't fit the story you'd told about yourself. "You don't have to be anyone different," I said softly. "You're still you. This doesn't change that." "But it does," he insisted, his eyes searching mine. "Everything feels different now. The way I see myself, the way I understand what I want, what I need. You've changed everything just by being you." His words should have felt like an accusation, but instead they sounded like wonder, like someone discovering a part of themselves they hadn't known existed. We stayed like that for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, kneeling on his floor, holding each other's gaze while the weight of decision pressed down on us. We could step back from this edge we'd been approaching. We could laugh it off, blame it on confusion or loneliness or too many late nights pressed together in the darkness. We could restore the careful boundaries we'd spent months dismantling and pretend we'd never glimpsed what lay beyond friendship. Or we could leap. Felix made the choice for both of us. Slowly, deliberately, he moved closer, abandoning the pencil that had brought us to this moment. His free hand came up to cup my face, his thumb tracing the same gentle path along my cheekbone that had become so familiar. "Tell me to stop," he whispered, echoing words from some half-remembered conversation, his face inches from mine. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I'd been waiting for this moment without knowing I was waiting, had been moving toward it since that first night on his couch when he'd wrapped his arm around me despite his own protests. Instead of speaking, I closed the distance between us, my lips meeting his in a kiss that felt both inevitable and shocking. For a moment, he went perfectly still, and I wondered if I'd misread everything, if I'd pushed too far past the boundaries of what he could accept. Then Felix kissed me back with a desperation that spoke of months of careful restraint finally breaking. His hand tightened against my face, his other arm coming around my waist to pull me closer, and I realized he'd been waiting too, had been moving toward this moment with the same unconscious certainty that had guided me. The kiss was soft and tentative at first, both of us still afraid of crossing a line we couldn't uncross. But gradually it deepened, became more sure, more necessary. Felix kissed me like he was memorizing the feeling, like he was trying to understand something fundamental about himself through the contact. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard, Felix rested his forehead against mine and closed his eyes. "I don't know what this makes us," he said quietly. "It makes us honest," I replied, my hand finding his. Finally honest. He opened his eyes and looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before, something between fear and relief, and a kind of wonder that made my chest tight with love for him. The afternoon light slanted through his window, casting everything in gold, and for the first time in days, the silence between us felt like peace rather than avoidance. We'd crossed the line we'd been approaching for months, and there was no going back now. In the aftermath of that first kiss, we moved with the careful deliberation of people who understood they were handling something precious and fragile. Felix helped me to my feet, his hand lingering in mine longer than necessary, and for a moment we simply stood there in the golden afternoon light, looking at each other with the slightly stunned expressions of people who had just discovered something they hadn't known they were searching for. The movie we eventually put on was forgotten almost immediately. We settled onto Felix's couch with a different kind of intention now. The careful geography we'd maintained for months finally abandoned. Felix pulled me against his side without hesitation, without the elaborate justifications we'd constructed for our previous intimacies. His arm wrapped around me with a certainty that spoke of some internal barrier finally dissolving. This time, when his fingers found their way into my hair, the touch carried no pretense of accident. When I turned my face toward his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of his skin, it wasn't a gesture I had to justify or explain away. We were allowed to want this now. We were allowed to have it. The silence between us had transformed completely. Where once it had been charged with everything we couldn't say, now it felt rich with understanding, comfortable in the way that comes only after truth has been spoken and accepted. Felix's thumb traced lazy patterns against my shoulder, and I could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath my cheek. Neither of us spoke about what had happened, what it meant, or what came next. The questions that had tormented us for weeks seemed suddenly irrelevant. We existed in the present moment, in the simple reality of being close to each other without apology or explanation. As the afternoon faded into evening, Felix's apartment took on the quality of a sanctuary, separate from the world outside, where we would eventually have to figure out how to be these new versions of ourselves. Here, with the curtains drawn and the outside world held at bay, we could simply be what we were, two people who had found something unexpected and necessary in each other. Felix shifted slightly, adjusting his position so he could see my face. In the dim light from the television, his features looked softer, more vulnerable than I'd ever seen them. The careful mask of confidence he wore for the outside world had been set aside, leaving only the person I'd glimpsed in our late-night conversations. "Are you okay?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying genuine concern. The question surprised me with its tenderness, with the way it acknowledged that crossing this line might have been overwhelming, that wanting him might be complicated for me too. It reminded me why I'd fallen for him in the first place, this capacity for care that existed alongside his uncertainty. "More than okay," I said honestly. "You?" Felix considered this for a moment, his hand still moving in gentle circles against my back. "Scared," he admitted, "but a good way, I think. Like when you're about to do something you've wanted to do for a long time, but weren't sure you were brave enough to try." I understood what he meant. There was something terrifying about finally having what you'd convinced yourself was impossible, about discovering that the person you'd been afraid to want had been wanting you back all along. The evening progressed with a dreamlike quality, each moment feeling both completely natural and slightly surreal. We ordered dinner from the Thai place down the street, eating directly from the containers while curled together on the couch. Felix fed me bites of pad thai with his chopsticks, laughing when I failed to catch a piece of chicken. These small intimacies, which would have felt charged with significance just days earlier, now seemed as natural as breathing. When Felix's phone buzzed with a text from someone in his economics class, he glanced at it briefly and then set it aside without responding, his attention returning immediately to me. The outside world, with its expectations and questions and complicated realities, could wait. As the night deepened, we migrated to Felix's bed with the easy familiarity of people who had been moving toward this destination for months. There was nothing urgent or frantic about the way we settled against each other. Instead, there was a kind of reverent slowness, as if we were both conscious of documenting this first night when we didn't have to pretend that being close was accidental. Felix pulled his heaviest blanket over both of us, creating the same cocoon of warmth and privacy that had sheltered our earlier tentative explorations. But now the space beneath the blanket felt different, charged not with uncertainty, but with possibility. He turned onto his side to face me, his hand coming up to trace the line of my jaw with a gentleness that made my breath catch. In the darkness, I could barely make out his features, but I could feel the intensity of his gaze, the way he was studying my face as if memorizing it. "I never thought I could feel like this," he whispered, his voice so quiet I had to strain to hear it. "About anyone, but especially not about someone who matters to me as much as you do." The honesty in his words, the vulnerability he was offering, felt like a gift. For someone who had built his identity around certainty, around knowing exactly who he was and what he wanted, admitting to this confusion required tremendous courage. "You don't have to understand it," I said, echoing the words I'd spoken on that first night when he'd admitted his feelings. "You just have to let yourself feel it." Felix nodded in the darkness, and I felt him relax against me, his body molding to mine with a familiarity that spoke of all the careful practice we'd had in being close. His arm tightened around me, no longer tentative or apologetic, but possessive in the best possible way. The last thing I remembered before sleep claimed us both was the sound of Felix's breathing evening out, the weight of his body against mine, and the overwhelming sense of rightness that came with finally being exactly where we belong. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, but inside the warm circle of Felix's arms, everything was still and perfect and exactly as it should be. We had crossed every line we'd drawn for ourselves, had moved beyond the careful boundaries of friendship into something deeper and more honest. Tomorrow would bring questions and complications, the need to figure out how to be these new versions of ourselves in the world beyond this room. But tonight, we were simply two people who had found their way to each other, finally brave enough to stop pretending they didn't belong together.